Hello, this is Bill Worrell with Virginia Cooperative Extension. For today's episode of 15 Minutes in the Forest, I'm going to take you into the mountain. We're going to go look at some rock cliffs and rock outcrops and talk about the wildlife habitat around those geographical features.
Hey everybody, my name is Wally Smith. I'm an associate professor of biology at the University of Virginia's College at Wise. We're here today up on High Knob in Wise County, Virginia, at a really beautiful site that you can see around me that's got a ton of rock outcrops and cliffs on it. And I thought this would be a great place to talk today about some best management practices that you can use on your property if you're looking to do timber management, any other kind of management practice on and around cliffs and rock outcrops like the one that you've got here. So this site might be a little bit extreme depending on the nature of your property, but a lot of folks around Virginia, especially in the mountainous regions of the state, have got something like this on their land, whether it's going to be a large cliff system, smaller outcrops like are next to me here, or even some smaller boulders that are possibly a little bit more reduced than the ones that you see in front of me. But really all of those different types of rock outcrop habitats are incredibly important for forest ecosystems overall, because those are what we refer to as embedded habitats. That means we're in a surrounding forest, and these are going to be relatively small scale features, kind of like isolated wetlands, headwater streams, other such habitats that aren't huge in scope, but are incredibly important for wildlife. And the site that we're here today is a really wonderful site for a number of rare species. Here in Southwest Virginia, we have an organism called the green salamander, which lives at this site. It's one of our rare rock outcrop specialists that can live nowhere else. There's several other amphibians. Depending on where you are in different parts of the state, you may have different species that live in this kind of habitat. And then also outside of the amphibian world, there's a number of mammals, Allegheny wood rats, for example, that love cliff systems like this. A number of birds, a lot of plant species as well. These become incredibly important places for organisms that are specialized to this kind of unique habitat. And unfortunately, one of the things that we have seen throughout Southwest Virginia, especially in the last 3 to 5 years, is a lot of habitat management operations, especially private clear cuts, are cutting timber right up to and adjacent to these types of cliffs and rock outcrops. So you've got the forest canopy removed, the understory removed, and unfortunately what we're seeing is that when that happens, we're losing some of these very sensitive species like the green salamanders and some of those others that live in this very unique kind of microhabitat. So today what I thought we could do is talk a little bit about what these habitats are, why forests around them are important. We'll show you a spectrum of habitats that have been managed well and not so well to kind of give you a feel for what you can do. And then I'll mention a few of those best management practices that you can use as a landowner to improve the quality of these habitats on your property, especially if you've got working lands. And so around me here, this is kind of the reference site, best example site for a rock outcrop that I wanted to show you. And I want to point out a couple of things about the site that we're at here. And the first isn't necessarily the rocks itself, but what you see around me with the forest structure. So we have obviously a great forest canopy here. It's a little bit rainy today, but we've got almost full shade at this site. The understory is intact. We've got some low vegetation up against those rock outcrops. And that's all important because this blanket of habitat that we've got around us really helps to maintain appropriate moisture and temperature conditions for the organisms, the critters, the plants that are adapted to this environment. Because generally speaking, in a shaded situation like this, those organisms are looking for cooler and more moist conditions. And so retaining that intact forest buffer around that site helps to maintain the habitat conditions that the wildlife are going to be looking for at a site like this one. So this is kind of the picture to keep in your mind as we're looking through some of the other sites that are in different stages of habitat quality. I'll talk a little more about what's happening at those sites, why the different management practices at those sites could be good or bad. But this is going to be, generally speaking, our reference, what you should strive for, type of condition if you've got rock outcrops in a closed canopy shaded situation on your property. All right, so here we are at a slightly different site than where we were before. The site that I showed you first, as I mentioned then, was kind of a reference condition. So that's what your typical relatively undisturbed natural outcrop is going to look like across most of Virginia, especially where I am in Southwest Virginia. This particular site behind me, when you first look at it though, you might think, this is the same thing. It's basically the same site and there's no difference at all. This site though has actually been manipulated a little bit, and I wanted to point it out because it illustrates really well some of the research that we've been doing over the last few years about best management practices with working, especially with timber operations around rock outcrops. And what has happened here, you'll notice, obviously the overstory is still here. There's full canopy all around me. The bigger trees have been left. But at this particular site, there was understory removal that was undertaken several years ago. Historically, before that occurred, you would have seen rhododendron, mountain laurel, your typical understory trees, smaller trees all around me at this site, all the way up to the face of the outcrop. And it looks kind of behind me like this area has almost been raked and cleared. You can't really see it in the frame, but behind me there's some big piles of woody vegetation that we'll probably take a look at just a little bit later. And that's the remnants of what used to be here, what was cleared several feet to several yards, out from this particular rock. In this particular location, this was done to open up habitat or open up space for rock climbers, for recreational rock climbing. But the same thing happens a lot on private lands. Even if you're not doing a large-scale timber harvest, for various reasons, folks might want to do some understory manipulation, remove some timber, remove some wood. And this is one of the things, unfortunately, that can happen when you've got these very sensitive embedded habitats on your land. And I wanted to come to this particular specific site because over the last few years, we've been doing some monitoring at this site to understand what happens to the condition and the health of the habitat in the rock outcrops when you do this type of manipulation. And we've specifically been comparing the temperature and the moisture levels at this site to some adjacent sites like the one that you saw earlier where that type of manipulation had not been done. Because as I mentioned earlier, most of the very sensitive organisms, wildlife species that live in these areas, they're there because of the lower temperatures and the increased moisture that good shaded rock outcrops provide. And really surprisingly, what we found at this site when we monitored it for about a year and consistently came out and looked at temperature, relative humidity, both at the rock surface and in the crevices in the rocks, the little cracks and nooks and crannies where different wildlife species live, a site like this one that has had this kind of manipulation done, even though you still relatively got a full canopy, removing this blanket of vegetation around the surface of the rock outcrop has dramatically changed the habitat quality. And at this particular site, we find that the rock outcrop is about 3 times warmer on any given day than a naturally occurring rock outcrop that hasn't had this manipulation done. And it's about 6 times drier at this site, which obviously is huge. If you're something like a salamander that can't, regulate your own internal temperature and your water balance that well, other organisms, plant, vascular, non-vascular plants, they're here because of that moisture, and that moisture is now gone because this rock has been opened up either to increase sunlight, even though we still have a canopy, and then especially increase wind exposure because that physical protection from the understory is gone. So once again, even though it does look like much, even this small amount of a habitat manipulation can still cause some issues. And you can imagine if something this minor has that big of an impact on the rock outcrop itself, what a larger scale form of disturbance, like a major clear cut that cut timber right up to the rock surface could do. And as I mentioned earlier, even though we're not at one of those sites today, we're seeing that increasingly in Southwest Virginia, even on some properties that are otherwise managed for conservation, where folks just don't know about the importance of these habitats and the unique set of conditions that need to be here for specialist wildlife, and folks are cutting right up to those rocks. So this is kind of the what you want to avoid type of situation. I wouldn't really call this, an overly disturbed habitat visually, but it has been disturbed ecologically. And so, trying to avoid this type of situation where the vegetation close to the rock has been removed is really critical. And in a moment, we'll go and talk about some ways that if you are going to have to do work on your property, some ways you can protect this and kind of some strategies that you can use to buffer around these types of habitats when you're having to alter habitat. All right, so here we are at a site where a lot of the wood that I mentioned at the last site we visited was dumped after it was cut. And just wanted to show it to illustrate how much of that understory vegetation can be present. As I mentioned at that other site, you look at it at first glance without seeing it beforehand, and you might not think it's that disturbed. But when you see this, this really illustrates, just how much habitat and just how much, vegetation structure can be around those rocks before disturbance happens. This is also really illustrative of that blanket that I mentioned before when it comes to keeping rock outcrops moist if they're under a full canopy, keeping the temperature down, kind of like covering somebody with a blanket is going to help them out. The exact same thing happens when you've got this wood that's not dead but is living out around that rock outcrop. And this is what got removed at the site I just mentioned a moment ago, where we've recorded those really dramatic changes in the habitat quality for all sorts of different species that can live at that site. At this particular site as well, I mentioned earlier, green salamanders is kind of the flagship rock outcrop species that lives especially across Southwest Virginia. At this site, we're relatively certain green salamanders are almost gone now. And the major source of decline, as far as we can tell, has just been this really simple habitat manipulation. Again, you would not look at it if you didn't know what you were looking at and think that it was something really severe. But for the organisms that rely upon these critically embedded habitats, this becomes incredibly important to making sure that their habitat quality stays pretty high. I also want to mention, you can probably see behind me some smaller rocks. You don't need to have 30, 40, 50 foot tall cliffs on your property for this kind of stuff to make a difference. A rock outcrop that's about my height, even up, chest height on me, that's about the size of a small sedan. Those kind of rocks, if they're there in the right habitat, there are multiple rock outcrops in the area, those can still provide really important spaces for some of those specialist organisms to live. So just wanted to mention and kind of emphasize, as we're talking about best management practices, it's not just really dramatic giant cliffs that matter. Smaller rock outcrops can still have some of the same phenomena like you're seeing here with the understory habitat that can be really important. So with all that said, what can you do? What are some recommended best management practices that you can follow on your property if you have a timber harvest planned, if you've got road construction plan, trail construction, any other kind of maintenance activity? What can you do to try to preserve some of the habitat around these sites? Unfortunately, there's not a lot of great research out there on specifically what buffer widths matter for different species. The science is kind of behind there, and we still don't have a lot of hard data illustrating what works. But generally speaking, since we do know that removing the habitat, woody vegetation around the rocks has such a strong influence, kind of following the leave it alone principle and making sure that you have as much minimal disturbance as possible around rock outcrops on your property is just a good rule of thumb. You'll see different recommendations out there. I've seen, I think in North Carolina, some agencies there recommend 500 to 600 feet of a protected buffer around any rock outcrops where specialist species are present. Here in Southwest Virginia, the Forest Service, when they're doing timber harvest on their property, they use a buffer of about several hundred feet. So whatever makes sense for you, it's not always totally avoidable when it comes to disturbance around rock outcrops, but leaving as much of that buffer as you can, keeping even the understory from being disturbed during those management activities, that's going to have benefits. It's going to help both the quality of the habitat and then also the resilience of that habitat for the species that live there long term. Another thing that we are kind of finding out is important as well. This is another place where there's not any kind of hard data really illustrating things one way or the other. But one thing that we're finding is to try to maintain, in addition to a buffer around your rock outcrops, corridors of intact habitat between adjacent rock outcrops. So in this case, I've got a rock outcrop behind me. If there's one several hundred yards down the hill from me, it's important to think about the organisms that live there, not just staying stuck in that rock, but also having to move back and forth for different parts of their life cycles, for reproduction, even courtship and mating in a lot of species. They do have to move between adjacent habitats to find different individuals for different behavioral interactions. So thinking about connectivity can also be really important. And to that end, what we recommend, also what the Forest Service does here in Southwest Virginia, is if you do have adjacent rock outcrops, buffering those outcrops and then maintaining that corridor of intact forested habitat between them as much as you can also be another best management practice that we think has some pretty important benefits. A lot of times too, depending on the species, rock outcrop specialists will tend to follow riparian buffers, which you're probably already putting on your property if you're doing a timber harvest. In some cases as well, if you have ridgetop rock outcrops, you may have corridors along the ridgeline of intact forest where species might like to move. But again, whatever you can do within the context of your management activity is going to be important. And if you can do, everything you can to protect as much habitat as you can around your rock outcrops, that's going to have those benefits long term. And I'll also mention that this isn't, regulatory stuff that I'm talking about. There is no Virginia regulation saying that you have to do this kind of thing around your rock outcrops. The one exception to that rule could be, if you do have confirmed federally protected species, that kind of thing on your property that are rock outcrop specialists, then you may have some regulations come into play. But generally speaking, this is a voluntary practice. It's something that's encouraged. But if you can do it, that's going to have benefits, both for the wildlife that's there and then also for the resilience of your property, because the wildlife that live in these habitats also provide energy and nutrients back out to the forest. So making sure that you protect these habitats as much as you can also help the resiliency and the recovery of a site after a management activity has occurred so that it's more productive long term. So those are going to be some best management practices you can use around these sites. As I said earlier, most folks around the state, if you have a big tract of land and you're in the mountains, especially on a ridge or along a stream valley, you probably have habitat like this. So hopefully this has illustrated a little bit about what to do and what not to do and what to watch out for when you're around these embedded microhabitats on your land.
I want to thank Wally Smith for joining us for today's episode, and I want to thank you for tuning in and learning about wildlife habitat around rock outcrops.